the music maker. Antonio Stradivarius stood quietly in the shadows of the narrow, deserted street. Once he took a step forward toward the sunlit square beyond, but then he hesitated and stepped back, allowing the darkness of the alley-like street to swallow him up again. His dark eyes were sad and lonely as he stared at the colorful carnival scene spread out before him. Always at carnival time it was like this. Everyone in the small Italian town of Cremona seemed to join in the music and the singing. Everyone, that is, except Antonio. At first he used to go to the village square along with his friends, but when the singing started they would begin to taunt him, laughing at him, and calling him Squeaky Voice. "Well, hello there, Squeaky Voice," someone called out behind him now. Antonio whirled about, straining his eyes in the flickering light of the alley. "Oh, hello," he said, recognizing at last the two boys who had come up behind him. "We're on our way to the square," the older boy, whose name was Luigi, told Antonio. "Roberta is going to sing, and I shall play my violin. Want to come along?" Antonio hesitated, looking with longing eyes at the violin the boy was holding, and then he looked down at his own hands. In one he held a knife, and in the other he held a small block of wood upon which he had been fiddling. The younger boy, Roberta, gave Antonio an impatient push. "Come on, if you're going to come," he cried. "The last night of the carnival, and we want to have some fun." Luigi laughed and flashed the violin tauntingly at Antonio. "Yes, come along, Squeaky Voice," he said. "You can fiddle there as well as anywhere." The two boys led the way, and Antonio followed them reluctantly, his eyes fastened on the violin in Luigi's hand. Antonio's love of music had once led him to take up violin lessons. How hard he had practiced! But no matter how hard he tried, his playing had not improved. The neighbors complained so much that at last Antonio's parents forced him to give up trying to play. And all the color and the excitement of the carnival burst upon Antonio as the boys left the alley-like street and came out into the square. Laughter and music were everywhere as the merrymakers danced and sang. The sun was just setting on the plains beyond Cremona, leaving the cloudless spring sky bathed in glowing tones of pink and red. The village square seemed to catch the colors from the sky and sprinkle them freely over the gay costumes of the carnival throng. For a little while the beauty of the scene made Antonio forget about his loneliness and his longings. People strolled by, paused to listen, and clapped when Luigi began to play. His tunes were gay and lively, and Roberta's voice as he sang the violin was sweet and clear. As Antonio watched Luigi's fingers moving swiftly along the strings of the violin, his own fingers were moving busily too. He hardly seemed to watch what they were doing, yet already the crude outline of a little violin was beginning to take shape beneath the careful movements of his knife. And after a while a man came along. He wore no carnival costume, and he did not seem to be taking part in the merrymaking. He moved up close and watched Luigi as he played. "That was nicely done, lad," he said when the song ended. And as he started to turn away, his eyes rested for a moment on Antonio. "What's that you're carving, boy?" he asked, stepping closer. "Oh, it is nothing," said Antonio, somewhat embarrassed by the attention of the stranger. Reluctantly he thrust forward the crude little violin so that the man could see it. "Indeed," said the stranger, kindly taking it in his hand. "It is not bad at all for a beginner." He examined it closely for a moment, and then he asked, "Do you like wood carving?" "Oh, yes," replied Antonio eagerly. Then he added, as if he were slightly ashamed, "It's really the only thing I can do." "Is that so?" replied the stranger. "Well, that is nothing to be embarrassed about, my boy. It is the only thing I can do, too." And handling the little violin, he put it back to Antonio. He gave the boy a friendly smile and turned away. As the stranger was swallowed up in the crowd of people, Luigi pulled at Antonio's arm excitedly. "Did you hear what he said?" exclaimed Luigi happily. "Did you hear the great Amati say how well I played?" "Who is Amati?" asked Antonio, shoving the unfinished violin into his pocket. "And why do you call him great?" Luigi stared unbelievingly at Antonio. "What?" he cried. "You have not heard of Amati? How can that be when he's the most famous man in all Cremona? Amati is a violin maker, the greatest in Italy." Luigi's words sent strange new ideas whirling through Antonio's mind. So the man was a violin maker. He could make beautiful music without playing the violin or singing, and he had said that Antonio's carving was not bad for a beginner. If Amati could teach him to make violins, Antonio would be able to make music too. Excitedly, Antonio turned and plunged into the carnival throng, trying to find Amati. As he pushed his way through the people, his ears no longer heard the music that had filled him with longing a little while before. His only thought now was to find the violin maker. Hours passed. Antonio sat again on the steps of the church, but now the square before him was nearly empty. Tired and discouraged, he was about to give up his search and drag himself home when a new thought occurred to him. "Of course," he cried aloud, "I will find out where Amati lives and go to his house. If he is so famous, everybody in Cremona will be able to tell me where he lives." It was no trouble at all to find out where Amati lived, and Antonio soon found himself before the house of the master violin maker. The windows were dark, and Antonio guessed that the people in the house must be asleep already. He sat down in the doorway to wait for daybreak, and soon he too was fast asleep. He was awakened very early the next morning by the sunlight shining into his eyes. He listened for sounds from the house, but it was still quiet. Antonio was too excited to fall asleep again, so he pulled out his knife and began carving on the little violin that was still in his pocket. "Just think," he told himself, "with my knife I have never done anything but whittle a few crude statues. But here on the other side of this door lives a man who with a knife and wood makes the most wonderful violins in Italy." Carving made the time pass quickly, and Antonio did not knock at the door until he had finished the tiny violin. When he did knock, Amati came to the doorway and stood behind the servant to see who was there. "Look!" exclaimed Antonio, "I have finished it. Tell me, sir, do you think from this little carving that I might learn to make real violins?" Amati smiled, recognizing Antonio from the night before. "Why do you wish to make violins?" he asked. "Oh, sir," cried Antonio, "I love music so much, and that I cannot even sing. I would give anything to be able to make beautiful music, but all I can do is whittle." Amati laid his hand upon Antonio's shoulder. "There are many ways of making music," he said softly. "Making violins is one way. Carving statues is another way. Painting pictures is another way. Every person in the world has his own way of making music, for the song in the heart is all that matters. Come into my house, and you shall have a chance to see if making violins is the way for you to make music. If you put your heart in your song, the song you sing by carving will be as beautiful as any other song in the world." And so Antonio Stradivarius became a student of the great Amati. All his life he tried to make each violin more nearly perfect, more beautiful than any he had ever made before. Now, whenever people think of violins, they think of Antonio Stradivarius, for he became the greatest violin maker that ever lived, not only in Italy, but in all the world.